Welcome everyone to the Danube Institute. I'm Melissa O'Sullivan, and speaking on behalf of my husband, John O'Sullivan, we're delighted to welcome this evening our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Calum Nicholson. Calum's going to give a lecture, and this is the final one in a series of lectures that he's given on science and technology. Climate policy, reflections on the place and role of science in society. To what extent can or should science guide us in understanding climate change's societal impact? Dr. Calum Nicholson holds an undergraduate degree in social anthropology from the University of Cambridge, a master's in migration studies from the University of Oxford, and a PhD in human geography. You know, Calum, over dinner I need you to explain just what is human geography. He is a former visiting fellow at the University of Oxford and has also served as a researcher in the British Parliament. A specialist and consultant on climate migration, as well as on the historical significance of social media, he currently teaches courses on international development, international migration, and the impact of social media at the University of Cambridge. He also writes and speaks on a wide range of social, political, and cultural issues for various outlets, including the Economic Standard, the New Humanist, and the Austrian Economic Center in Vienna, founded by our dear friend, Dr. Barbacombe. So welcome, Calum. We're grateful to have you here this evening, and we look forward to your remarks.
So first of all, thank you so much for coming along, and just give everyone a chance to kill the phones. Okay, so today's talk is titled Climate Policy, Reflections on the Place and Role of Science in Society. Now, in the last 6 months, I've given 3 other talks here, one on culture in crisis, what the pandemic reveals about, or the response to the pandemic reveals about the West and its prospects, which is really about the role of science around COVID in contemporary society. I gave another one on the impact of social media, which is about the technology in social media, and the culture that's led to the way social media is being used now in society, and another one recently on the role of expertise in contemporary society. So there's a running theme here of the place of science in society, and this is the last of this series, and this one's on climate policy, which is really the topic that arguably I should know something about, because this is what my PhD was on. Okay, so I want to begin with 2 stories today. The first takes us back to 1970. On the 31st of May of that year, a 7.7 magnitude earthquake lasting 45 seconds devastated Peru, flattening 160,000 buildings, 80% of those in the region, leaving 500,000 people homeless and killing 70,000. To this day, it is the worst natural disaster in the recorded history of the Western Hemisphere. Some years later, in a paper entitled Peru's 500-Year Earthquake, Vulnerability in Historical Context, the anthropologist Anthony Oliver Smith argued that this earthquake was not, in fact, an event that lasted 45 seconds, but rather several centuries, because, he argued, it took several centuries of colonialism and terrible government and cultural destruction to render that country so vulnerable to the quake. The region was always prone to earthquakes. That much had always been known. Before Spanish colonialism, the pre-Columbian Andean peoples had mitigated risk by spreading their resources over large areas rather than concentrating them in towns. They also did not build towns in areas of high seismic activity, even if that land was convenient and fertile, like in the area of Arequipa. Where they did build, they employed techniques and materials that provided some measure of safety. They tied walls together, allowing them freedom to move in an earthquake, that restricting them from collapse. They didn't tile their roofs, but thatched them, so that if the roof collapsed, you would not be hit on the head by a heavy object. And they established storehouses of grain and so on for emergency use. Then, when the Spanish arrived, they built towns for convenience, not heeding the warnings passed down through tradition and local memory. They built a city at Arequipa, which was then destroyed promptly by earthquakes and rebuilt 4 times in the 17th century alone. They employed Spanish building techniques, untied walls, building tall, and using ceramic barrel roof tiles, not thatch. and the Spanish also took the surplus grains as tax, leaving nothing in the emergency storehouses. As a result, according to Oliver Smith, to quote him, the society that confronted the major seismic event on the afternoon of the 31st of May 1970 was in many ways already a catastrophe. The untied walls collapsed into the narrow streets, burying pedestrians, while the heavy tiles killed those still inside the houses. As Oliver Smith writes, in the last analysis, much of the devastation and misery caused by the earthquake was a product of the historical processes set in motion at the time of the conquest. These processes ultimately subverted, he writes, the general effective adaptations to the many environmental hazards worked out by the people of the Andes over the 10,000 years of human residence in the region. Thus, the advanced vulnerability of the region, he argued, is a socially created phenomena, a historical product brought into being by identifiable forces. So the second story I want to tell brings us back to slightly before the pandemic. Feels like a long time ago. So in November 2019, perhaps the leading journal on climate change, Nature Climate Change, published a special issue on my topic, climate migration. The most prominent paper in this collection, entitled Climate Migration Myths, was the product of 31 co-authors, almost all of whom are household names if your household studies climate migration, which is obviously not everyone's household, but to me, I knew most of the names. The paper was notable because its very premise was rather startling, at least to someone reading it who had not spent much time engaging with the literature on this topic over the previous 10 to 15 years. The article began by arguing that we need to question, not affirm, the, quote, assumption that climate change causes mass human migration because, to quote, migration is not solely driven by climate change, but instead by a mix of climatic, socioeconomic, cultural, and political factors. The article went on to note that even when climate change does play a role, it remains difficult to determine the extent of its influence. From this, the article made clear that, quote, categorizing climate migrants as distinguishable from non-climate migrants is not empirically possible in most, if not all, circumstances. As a consequence, predictions of mass climate-induced migration are inherently flawed, it said. In a 2019 monograph, one of the paper's co-authors, Dr. Sarah Nash, further argued that, quote, no accepted definition of climate migration actually exists, and explained that attempts at quantification make the illusion of a deeper understanding of causal linkage, and that such attempts are on shaky ground methodologically and fail to recognize both the multi-causality of migration and climate change adaptation efforts. She later noted that there is, quote, there is no easily identifiable community of affected people at the center of the phenomenon, whatever the phenomenon of climate migration is supposed to refer to. While perhaps perplexing for those unfamiliar with this area of research, such claims are rather old hat for those who've worked within it and are in keeping with excellent empirical and analytical work done on the topic over the last 2 decades. Indeed, perhaps the most consistent and clear conclusion of the vast literature on the causal linkage between environmental or climate change and displacement or migration is precisely that nothing consistent or clear can be concluded on this topic. If there is one pattern that holds true across the literature on this topic, it is precisely that we do not know what climate migration is supposed to be, as distinct from non-climate migration, nor by extension who climate migrants are relative to any other sort of migrant. But instead of saying anything coherent, or in lieu of saying anything coherent, the literature does say something, but there tends to be, if you read it quite carefully, a tendency to fall into a pattern of what I see as 6 tendencies. The first tendency is contradiction. So, for example, in a 2021 piece, an author first states that there is no direct connection between climate change and human migration, before proceeding in the same piece to refer to the issue, this highly complex issue, such movements, the movement, people deeply affected, the matter, and how this type of mobility unfolds, and ends the piece by stating that the issue of climate mobilities is real. Within this is a contradiction, or perhaps a sort of epistemic superposition, where it is at first denied that there is a discernible relationship between climate change and migration, but then also claimed that there is one. This is what I have come to call quantum reasoning, where the speaker occupies contradictory positions simultaneously. Like Schrödinger's cat, the idea of a climate migrant is both dead and alive at the same time, depending on how you want it to be. The contradiction brings to mind an observation by the sociologist Andrew Abbott, who wrote in 1998 in reference to causal explanation, or the prevalence of causal claims among sociologists. He wrote that action and contingency disappear into the magician's hat of variable-based causality, where they hide during the analysis only to be reproduced with a flourish in the article's closing paragraphs, pulled out like a rabbit. So that's the first tendency, contradiction. The second tendency of the climate migration literature, in lieu of it saying anything more clear, is what I call banality. This is to make claims that are so general and sweeping in nature, but which nevertheless offer us little, if any, guidance on what might occur in any specific case of so-called climate migration. For instance, there will be a statement that, quote, there is a causal connection between climate change and population movement, but this is often not direct and is mediated by a range of factors playing out in different ways. Sometimes such statement, that sort of statement is so general, it could really mean anything. Sometimes such general statements are in fact framed simply as negations, describing what is missing. When people talk of the need for a governance framework for climate migration, they are not offering a clear explanation of what is needed, but simply describing by negation what we lack. So the first tendency was contradiction and banality. The third is kind of the opposite of the generality of banality, which is the arbitrariness of a very specific claim. In these cases, a specific case or anecdote is cited about a particular event or context, a particular village where the river moved and maybe some people migrated, where the environmental factors are seen to have some bearing on the social outcome. However, it is in the nature of these very specific instances that we can't really induce general claims about the impact of climate change on them, transcendent of local, social, political, and economic circumstance. What was upstream of the river, for instance? The fourth tendency is what I call category laundering. So in a single piece, we might see a panoply of different terms that all seek to explain the same causal relationship between climate and migration. So for instance, in the same 2021 piece I mentioned earlier, the terms include climate migration, the climate migration nexus, climate mobilities, mobility in the context of climate change. I remember reading one book that had 17 different synonyms for the term. The variety of these terms suggests a topic that's quite ill at ease with itself. For if the underlying claim, the causal claim, is stable, why the need to continue shifting the categories we use? And if the claim is unstable, what precisely are they describing? Indeed, if the terms do not share so much in common as to have an identical thing they're referring to, then what specifically sets them apart? Perhaps, however, if the central causal claim is not clear, we could think that maybe the language is just being laundered as one launders money in order to stop or arrest any logical chain of critical investigation. Because often with these topics, when we see the language change, you may be able to critique one of the terms. If it's called climate migration, you can critique it. But then if the language changes to call it climate mobility, are you still critiquing the same thing? And so the exercise in policymaking escapes critique. The fifth tendency is what I call epistemic can-kicking. This is the tendency to tacitly acknowledge the failure of current research by simply calling for more research. In a recent piece, despite earlier writing that there is no direct connection between climate change and human migration, the author goes on to add that climate mobilities is an important subject of concern in need of further research. However, they do not make clear how future research might avoid the errors in present research that have led to the need for more. And the final tendency is tautology. So tautology logically is a statement like, it is raining or it's not. That is a logically true statement, unless you live in the UK, obviously, but it's a logically true statement, it's raining or it's not. But it's not very useful if you want to know whether you need to bring an umbrella. That's kind of what the problem with tautology. They are logically true, but in a sense quite useless. So if you look at the climate migration debate, you'll see claims such as these. And by the way, all the ones I'm about to cite are from the UK government 2011 Foresight report on climate migration. These were its conclusions in the executive summary. Claims that some people will leave climate hotspots and some will not. that people are as likely to migrate to places of environmental vulnerability as from these places. Again, a tautology. That environmental change is equally likely to make migration less as more probable, that there is a continuum of forced to voluntary of migration in the face of climate change, and that immobility, not migrating, matters as much as mobility. All these claims are true, but they are also not useful. They are true only to the extent that they are logical truths. People must be migrating from or to, or migrating or not at all, or that must be voluntary or forced in some sort of continuum. They are true only to the extent to which they are logical truths, covering all possible options without helping us decide which option we need to choose now in any particular case. So it is for all these reasons that the Nature Climate Change paper published 2 years ago took a rejection of the term climate migration and the causality it implies as its premise, as its starting point, not its conclusion, its starting point. However, in reframing the research agenda to focus instead, as they argued, on climate mobility from climate migration, the 31 authors either do not escape the causal assumption they seek to avoid, or if they do, then they are really no longer talking about climate or even migration. That is, they're either engaging in a distinction without a difference, or they are doing something so different as to be essentially irrelevant to any discussion of the effects of climate change or the causes of migration. Now, this is a provocative claim, and I probably need to explain a little bit. So in order to avoid the causal assumption implied when you talk about climate migration, the authors of this paper emphasize the need for, quote, research that better accounts for the non-linear complexity of mobility in the context of climate change and social change to counteract the linear crisis and mass migration assumptions built on attempts to quantify and predict climate migration that they say are widespread in the news media and policy discourses. To do this, they define mobility as encompassing short and long-term movement, near and long-distance movement, movement to and from a particular location, impacts such as movement on places of origin, transit, and destination, the realities, they say, of multi-causality and immobility, not just mobility, but immobility too. However, if they are indeed avoiding the idea of climate migration, and if the intentionally general phrase context of climate change that they use is used to keep the causal relationship between climate change and mobility vague, it does raise the question of why are they talking about mobility as a social effect of climate change at all? Or indeed, why are they privileging climate as an influence on mobility? Surely by the inclusive logic of climate mobilities, climate affects everything, not just migration. And mobility, to the extent to which this refers simply to movement as opposed to society in general, is itself affected by everything, not just climate. What, therefore, does the climate mobility framework advance in terms of a project for understanding the societal impacts of climate change, which is the reason why it gets funding? The problem is, when everything is amplified, the risk is that nothing is clarified. If we can say anything, or even everything, we're actually, logically speaking, closer to saying no thing than we are to saying something. We are, at any rate, no better than when we started. All these paradoxes and fallacies that I've mentioned, this absurdity, typify where research on the relationship between climate change and human migration is in 2022. After more than 2 decades of research on this topic, and it's been several more decades, but intensively for the last 2 decades, there remains little to no clarity as to what climate migration is, or who or what it could possibly refer to. And indeed, there remains no sense as to how this problem of knowledge, this deficit of knowledge, could be solved. Okay, so I've told these 2 stories about a 1970 earthquake and a scholarly paper that I don't really like from 2019, because they have, I think, some bearing on how we understand and frame our understanding of climate change. The story of the 1970 earthquake underlines an important point that is familiar to disaster risk reduction scholars for over 4 decades, but often neglected by contemporary scholars of climate change adaptation who seek to find policies of how we adapt to climate change. And this familiar point to disaster risk reduction scholars is as follows. They understand that hazards may be natural, but disasters are social, political, and economic. Earthquakes, they say, don't kill people. What kills people is collapsing buildings. And of course, that's dependent on a whole range of societal factors, building regulations, corruption, emergency response, and so on. In a sense, the sociological factors about the human world matter as much, if not more, than the scientific ones about the natural world, in all but the most extreme cases, which are quite rare. If this is all true for earthquakes, distinguishable as they are in space and time, an earthquake happens in a particular place on the Earth's surface for an amount of time we can measure, then it's surely also true for how we understand global climate change, which is not only global rather than local in its framing, but also, according to the IPCC's own definition of climate change, refers to not any particular data point about the climate in time, but a 30-year rolling average, because that is the definition of climate change. The story of the 2019 paper I mentioned shows us that even if we were to assume that we could generalize from an event in the natural world to its societal consequence, there is still little internal coherence in our understanding of the consequences of climate change that is even as clear-cut as migration. We still don't really know, even our attempt to understand a particular, seemingly obvious form of societal impact of climate change like migration is really difficult to get into. We get stuck in contradictions, tautologies, arbitrary and banal claims, can-kicking, and category laundering. This matters, I think, because if climate adaptation policy or law is to be written about migration or displacement in the context of climate change, it's first important to understand who such people are or would be, as opposed to who they are not or would not be. Sarah Nash makes this case persuasively, writing how these problems of ambiguous knowledge, to quote her, make the nexus between migration and climate change difficult to pin down, making it in turn incredibly difficult to address precise but wide-reaching policies. This matters, she argues, because, quote, if policymaking is to provide solutions, a known phenomenon must be present to be solved. Indeed, she goes so far as to say that, quote, a recognition of a relation between migration and climate change is foundational for the construction of a policy-making discourse. For if no relation exists, why is a policy response called for? Wanting to take action on the societal impacts of climate change, notably migration, is an understandable goal, regardless of whether one's motivation is to help migrants or to stop migration, or indeed both, because they are not necessarily mutually exclusive concerns. But arbitrary actions are, with equal surety, no better than no action at all, and in some respects may potentially be worse. The road to hell is a paved one, after all. But the first and indeed central problem here, when we find ourselves discussing the societal impact of climate change, is not so much about what those impacts are, or indeed what ought to be done to act upon or address or govern them. Rather, the first and central problem, it seems to me, is in fact about ourselves and our institutions. That is, the people, we, who are interested in the other two problems, the problem of what climate migration is and the problem of what we ought to do about it. So the questions we need to ask ourselves more reflexively among them are, what value do we put in rigor in analysis and debate? I'd say clearly not very much on this topic. Does a concern for rigor trump the emotiveness of the topic at hand? This is at the very least a concerningly open question on this topic. And what ultimately would constitute a standard for a rigorous and thus useful conceptual claim, let alone the empirics that would connect it to the real world? This is the real question we should be asking, but are not. But perhaps even before that question, we need to ask why we are continually drawn to think of the societal effects of climate change in such a way where we are drawn into talking about topics like climate migration or climate mobility, even when we admit, as the authors of that paper did, that we can't establish the causal relationship at the heart of the concept. I would like to suggest that it is because we are operating, however unwittingly, with a particular metaphor in mind, one which I want to argue is entirely inappropriate to understanding society, migration not least. So in the case of climate migration, it seems to me that the implicit metaphor is a classical mechanical one, inclusive of assumptions that are really social scientific versions of Newton's three laws of motion. And so we all maybe I didn't particularly for a long time, but I reminded myself, we all learned in high school Newton's 3 laws of motion. Okay, so let's just go through them. It's very simple. So the first law of motion holds that a body will remain at rest unless acted on by another force, or in its current state. Now, regarding human migration, there seems to be, when we talk about so-called climate migration, a sedentary assumption that if it wasn't for climate change, people would have remained where they are. That's the first kind of framing assumption. Why we think climate migration is a problem is the assumption they would not have migrated otherwise. Then the second law of motion holds that when a body is acted on by another force, the rate of movement will be proportional to the force applied. And again, we see this implied when we talk about climate migration. There is an assumption that the rate of migration will be directly proportional to the magnitude of the climate change that occurs. It's assumed there's a linear relationship, a mechanical relationship. Then the third law of motion, according to Newton, is that any action always meets an equal and opposite reaction. Now again, regarding migration, there is an assumption that any change in human migration patterns will be proportionally disruptive and thus unwelcome for the society that receives it. So we can also see these laws applying to the societal effects of climate change in general, not just to migration. There is a presumption that without the action of climate change, society would remain as it is. That society will then be forced to change in proportion to the magnitude of climate change, and that any such change will be a problem that can and indeed must be met with resistance, or at least some sort of policy program. This mechanical metaphor, I want to put it to you, has always been inappropriate for understanding the societal impacts of climate change, migration not least. Not only inappropriate in its particulars, but also in its general spirit. The general problem is precisely that it is spiritless. It is a dead model that assumes that people are simply terrestrial bodies that we may categorize, model, and predict as we do celestial ones. It is a monistic framework that assumes people are a unity, sharing a common outlook, compelled by the same desires and fears, and in receipt of the same facts, rather than, as we are, a plurality with endlessly divergent mores, motives, and forms of meaning. As such, it is a metaphor founded, it seems to me, not simply on a misunderstanding, but on an exclusion of everything that makes us human, the particular, the subjective, the contradictory, and the uncertain. To talk of climate migration, and indeed to talk of any of the other societal impacts of climate change, is always, it seems to me, always and inescapably, to talk from within this mechanical metaphor, for any such discussion always implies, in the end, a concern for causality. Herein lies the paradox at the heart of the literature on climate migration and the social science of climate impacts in general. And the paradox is this: to speak coherently on the subject requires one to adopt a classical mechanical metaphor. But the moment we adopt this classical mechanical metaphor, we retreat into an abstract realm bearing little relation to the real world and the lives of real people as they live them. For at least a decade, this paradox has been something of an unwelcome elephant in the corner of any conference room where the societal impacts of climate change is discussed. And I've been in enough of them. It's a topic that comes up in the pub afterwards, but not during the conferences. While many researchers seem to recognize the paradox's existence, few are willing to formally and publicly contemplate its full implications, probably because they fear it's too close to sounding like climate denial. Yet the paradox is no less conspicuous for being ignored and constitutes the most profound and pressing issue facing research on this topic, regardless of whether that research is empirical, about data, or normative, about laws, because it has vast implications, not just for what researchers and policymakers decide ought to be done, but also for what they decide can even be said about the very thing they are interested in, the societal ramifications of climate change. Assuming this above argument I've made holds, assuming it's convincing, it suggests that our problems with climate change lie not in our grasp of the science, but our grasp of the social science, or rather, that our grasp of the limits of science in terms of the extent to which it can inform, let alone guide, our action, adaptive efforts not least. One might even say that our understanding of climate change is informed less by a rich understanding of the science as an impoverished understanding of people, of ourselves. of society. And naturally enough, these arguments, I think, have consequences for both the politics of climate change and the policies that are pursued in response to it. So first, the politics. Now, typically, and rather tediously, there are famously two political positions on climate change, so-called believers and deniers, although purebred deniers are quite hard to find these days. Both saw themselves as opposed to each other, which seems natural enough, as they firmly disagree on whether climate is a problem. But one might instead argue, I think, that they are in fact united by what they share, or they have more in common than they care to realize. First, they both seem to be founded, both the believers and deniers, seem to believe, their views seem to be founded on a refusal to consider part of the evidence. The deniers don't tend to grasp, or at any rate, they do reject the science, while the believers don't seem to understand, or perhaps have not read, the social science. Or at least if they've read it, they've not accepted or understood or taken into account the consequences of its very ambiguity. As I've said, the most consistent conclusion of the social science on the impacts of climate change societally, particularly migration, is that it is inconclusive. Second, both fail to question the same underlying assumption. That is, what I'd argue is the classical mechanical metaphor, or the framing. The believers hold it implicit in their concern. It's obviously implied that that the amount of climate change will cause something very disruptive. And the deniers do not question the classical mechanical framing, but simply say climate change is not an external force, but a figment of overactive imaginations. In the face of these two simplistic and polarized positions, there is perhaps a third one that might be adopted. That is, if we shifted the question from the climatic factors to the societal factors, and the focus from the science to the social science. That is, to accept the science, even simply as a matter of risk aversion, but to approach the social science with much more caution, or to at least assume there is social science, that it's not simply a question of science. In this sense, the debate on this topic I find to be very similarly structured to that around COVID. The science of COVID has been excellent, both in the epidemiology of how it spreads in populations and the virology of the disease itself. And I think it's all been a tribute to the power of our scientific institutions and know-how. However, throughout the pandemic, we have seen governments repeatedly state in their policy decisions that in their decisions to adopt, for instance, lockdown policies, that they have been following the science. But the matter of the proportionality of universal house arrest, which was obviously rebranded as lockdowns, is not a matter of objective science. It is as much a matter of subjective culture and value. What is the balance between living life and avoiding death? Between saving lives and keeping livelihoods? These are questions that science has no answer for, and there has been a remarkable silence from philosophers and thinkers across the world on these difficult questions of how to weigh the difficult trade-offs and indeed questions of what sort of society we wish ourselves to be, or indeed believe that we are. With COVID, as with climate, or indeed with climate as with COVID, there are deniers who deny the disease exists. This is foolish and a fanciful position. But on the other side, there is also a zero COVID position, which, much like the calls for the pursuit of carbon zero at all political economic cost, is equally fanciful and perhaps even more harmful, as it at once is advocating widespread societal changes and top-down command that would be disastrous for freedom and democracy, but also probably not even practical, and also likely would fail anyway, simply because it is founded on a shaky grasp of what society is and how people react and behave. For starters, therefore, it would be good if the two antagonistic camps on the climate could descend from the heights of their political poles, and instead of one side pointing at the other side and saying they are the problem, and vice versa, instead agree that the issue is precisely over the place of science in society and the grounds on which we can take science as a guide to both how to think about and act on society. Whether the debate is on COVID or climate, I have been really startled at the failure in recent years within governments, the media, the universities, to debate these questions with the dispassion, rigor, and presumption of good faith that they, and I think we as a society, deserve. As for the consequences, so those are the consequences for politics. As for the consequences for policymaking of the causal problems I've outlined when we talk about the societal impacts of climate change, I should first note that an awareness of the problems, of these causal problems, has not in fact slowed down the academic policy industrial complex, nor tempered interest in it, whatever it, climate migration, is supposed to be. In her 2019 book that I mentioned, Sarah Nash demonstrated that various institutions are in fact engaged in, to draw on a metaphor from finance, what I've called a sort of intellectual self-trading, or perhaps epistemic manipulation, kind of like economic self-trading or market manipulation, in which those involved in, to quote her, creating knowledge in response to calls that they had a hand in creating. So these institutions will say, we need research on climate migration. They will then fund the research, which is done by their own people. And then that research is inconclusive. And so they say, well, we need more money to do more research. Nothing is ever achieved, but the money keeps going around. And she wrote a book exposing this. So I've called that epistemic manipulation or intellectual self-trading because it's doing the same thing. It's market making. What is the motivation for this sort of incestuous circular relationship that overlooks the elephant in the room? As one of Nash's interviewees admits in her book, in a moment I thought of startling candor, this person said, we have to position the organization in a way that we can apply for adaptation funding and green funding and climate funding. In short, elephants in the room become less visible if people's livelihoods depend on ignoring them. There is a danger in all this of losing legitimacy, of being accused of crying wolf, as the moral imperative among scholars and practitioners to do something outstrips their capacity to clearly state not only what to do, but also what problem exactly they are seeking to solve when they talk about the societal impacts of climate change. Pointing out the risk of this, of sort of losing legitimacy, of crying wolf a bit, is not to deny the importance of action on climate change. Rather, it is precisely because it is important that we must strive to be cautious, rigorous, and dispassionate in our analyses, and as aware of the limits on what we can know, as we are vocal about what we think ought to be done. So what is then the alternative? How else might we approach formulating policy on climate change in a way that might avoid the sort of classical mechanical metaphor I pointed out before and have argued is inappropriate for understanding societal impacts of things like climate change? Perhaps we might begin by adopting a different metaphor to counter the failings of the classical mechanical one. And once again, perhaps we can look to physics for this. Newton's classical mechanical laws of motion are, of course, still useful for specific jobs like building the chain bridge. But they proved inadequate to explain the movements of the stars and specifically of light, and indeed the nature of gravity itself. To explain those, society had to wait over 200 years for the theories of relativity. Einstein's general relativity tried to explain gravity by saying it was not a force per se, but rather simply the warping of the fabric of space-time by mass, like the Earth, much as how a bowling ball thrown onto a mattress leaves a depression into which things will then fall. If you try and put a marble across a mattress with a bowling ball, we know it will orbit it. That's basically what Einstein's general relativity argued, that gravity is not a force, it's the shaping of space-time. We are feeling ourselves falling into the shape of space-time warped by mass. So the Earth isn't pulling us down, we are just falling into a depression in space-time that it creates. Similarly, and by analogy, I think we could all benefit from taking a generally relative view of the relationship between policy and society. For society, think of it like space-time. It's a continuum, an almost infinite network of relationships, of emotional bonds, an invisible web of trust and commitments. When we then drop a public policy, a new norm, a new law, onto the fabric of our relationships, they warp. The fabric of our relationships is warped by law and policy. It renders some relationships so conditional that trust can be broken entirely, as I think Hungary experienced under communism, for instance. I was recently talking to a Hungarian who lived until he was 30 under communism, and he said of all the traumas that were suffered by Hungary and the Warsaw Pact countries under communism, he said one of the worst was the breaking of trust between ordinary people, because the narratives of the regime were so unforgiving that they distorted the capacity for human empathy, so you had people reporting on each other. And he said it's precisely that rending of the social fabric that he felt was the thing that still remains quite damaging, because there was a loss of trust. But the same can happen in any society when any new narrative, however well-intentioned, is dropped prescriptively onto a community. even a narrative as morally virtuous as the climate one. If science, a way of thinking that aspires to be objective, is held to be a basis for our culture and values, the result is that we find ourselves living under not a regime of science, but a tyranny of scientism. That is an ideology that believes that science isn't just a way of looking at the facts, but actually can be a guide to what our values should be. And it's a way of looking at things that has no room for the subjective, no room for the particular or the emotional, and the plurality of real human lives as we live them. And the consequences of this tension between our ideals and our reality is that in real life, as under communism, people will suffer and relationships will erode. Thus, we might try to adopt an approach to research that did not simply take an interest in the relationship between science and society, but also the relationship between the institutions that do science and or prescribe policies that will change society and society itself. A little more self-awareness and awareness not just of our imperatives, but our limits would not go amiss. So to conclude, in debates over climate change, or indeed over COVID, the social part, I think, is best understood not just as a conclusion or a consequence, but really part of the equation of what we're looking at. Be it COVID or climate, societal outcomes are not themselves determined by the science, nor even are they simply a secondary or even equal half of the equation of our analysis. I would argue that they are in fact the most important, the social aspects, the most important and the most difficult thing to understand, for the social context is the very context within which we generate the science and also apply it. This is harder to understand than the science because it is inherently reflexive, subjective, and political about not just what is, nor even what ought to be, but also, and crucially, about what we can in fact know about either of these things and then do as a consequence. To some great extent, it is arguable that the discussion of climate change has such mass and popular appeal and resonance today, not because its societal consequences are in fact clear, because I don't think they are, but because it is presented in the language of hard science, which is reassuring, as it implies the world is knowable, that the future is predictable, and that consensus purposes in society are achievable, leaving all our real problems to be simply purely technical in nature, a matter of not why we care about X, be it climate, or even what climate migration is, but simply how to implement answers we think we know to problems we're sure we understand, when in fact we don't understand them and we don't know. These are all false beliefs, or rather they are simply articles of faith, not of science. Religion has its place, but faith in science is a dangerous path. It is a little surprise, I think, therefore, that the current climate movement has the ring of millenarianism to it, claims that we've sinned against the climate and the planet and must rise up to save ourselves, and that the figurehead for this broadly acephalous movement is in fact a charismatic preacher in the guise of a latter-day child saint. In policymaking, we cannot simply think like technocrats or adopt a wholly technocratic mindset, because culture and value also matters. But what matters most is, I think, our attitude. And the most sustainable and important attitude when we're looking at issues around big public policy issues, particularly around issues like climate, is the attitude of humility, not in the face of the facts, but of everything beyond the facts, everything beyond the science, everything we might not know, and indeed might not be able to put into words if we do. As the poet T.S. Eliot wrote, and I think my favorite lines in the English language, the only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. I think we ought to bear this in mind when we consider climate policy, and especially the place and role of science in society. Thank you very much.
Could I just ask you, are you familiar with Ferdinand Braudel and Ferdinand Braudel and the historical school of cleometrics?
No.
Okay. So just to, it's very interesting that your definition, which I guess is the UN definition of climate change, is a 30-year rolling. But I would have thought that the historical record would provide extremely clear instances of the sort of migration that they're referring to.
What, historically, migration and...
The effect of a dramatic climatic changes,
sure,
like destroying civilizations.
Sure. No, I think certainly the climate we're not detached from environmental factors, of course not. My point is about if in a legal context we're trying to identify a climate migrant or trying to find within a sort of technocratic context particular policies to address very particular societal consequences of climate change in contemporary society, I think it ends up being much more ambiguous. My point is not, I have to be quite careful, my point is not to say climate is not a factor. I've never said, I've actually made quite clear, I think that it's not to say climate doesn't matter. My concern is that there's a presumption that social science is clear when it's not. I think there's a need for much more clarity, much more rigor, where I don't really see that happening. So I think, of course, climate matters, but precisely because it does, we need to be much more careful about what its consequences are. But I certainly think that in a sort of pre-societal or pre-modern context, certainly things are quite consequential. But there is a danger of assuming today that the environmental factors, issues such as carrying capacity, for instance, which would apply to, say, elephants or something, or mice, these sorts of concepts don't really apply in the same context with people for a whole range of different reasons. So I'd agree with you, but I think I think my point is less saying there is no migration from climate change. I'm being quite careful not to say that. My point is I'm not sure what we're talking about when we're currently talking about it. So the point's less about is there a climate migrant or not. It's saying what is our standard for identifying one? And indeed, why are we trying to identify one? In what context? For who to do what? Those are where it all gets very ambiguous. These questions are simply not being discussed sufficiently, I don't think. Please.
I'll just speak.
Sure.
Thank you. Thanks. Yes, it's just when you chose the example of Peru, you went back several hundred years in that particular case. And so surely that's a very, very clear historical evidence, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no, I think so. But the point there is that what's happened over several hundred years are the societal factors changing. I don't think that one of the concerns I have with the current framing around, say, climate change adaptation, a lot of the discussions around it, is often it's presented in a way that's assuming that the climate can be isolated as an independent variable that determines the outcome of the dependent variable. It's a simplistic causal claims being made in a technocratic context because the language of technocracy likes those sorts of claims. It likes to assume that society is like billiard balls on a table, that we can predict things. There's a certain hubris in that. My position, I try to make it clear in talk, it actually never comes across that clearly, no matter how I approach it. I'm not arguing, in fact, I have no position on whether there are climates affecting migration per se. What I'm arguing is that the entire way we're approaching this topic, the climate topic, has built within it sort of simplistic understandings of what we're looking for that I don't think reflect what's going on, but also they're not even very useful. Because if we don't have a framing, almost an epistemological framework for understanding causality, if it's not valid, then in a sense, what are we doing with the policies? If we don't know what the policies are about, in a sense, then we don't know the unintended consequences of them. And in the meantime, they're very expensive. So my point is not about stating there is no causal claim. I'm saying the best of the social science cannot establish one that's useful. So it's a slightly different point. But I think the 500-year example was precisely saying it's 500 years of sedimented history rather than literal sediment, which has led to the outcomes that we saw in 1970.
But clearly, like, I'm sorry.
No, please, go ahead. Yeah, that's great.
But clearly, like, when some dramatic climate event occurs, say, for instance, an earthquake, you do see, like, very radical innovation. So, I mean, you chose Peru, but I would have thought that a better example is actually the 77 earthquake in Bucharest, where, the entire city had to be rebuilt. Similar scale as well. I mean, almost as many people died in Bucharest.
That's true.
And the construction standards in Romania were revolutionized.
But this is kind of my point, though. I think what you're saying there is precisely what I'm saying.
But that's post facto. I mean, that's after the things happened, when all the death and destruction has occurred. I mean, so there's something to be said for anticipating these things as well.
That's true, but I think the point I was making with the Peru example is that the society in the Andes had, in fact, had a good cultural memory about earthquakes. They didn't build cities in Arequipa. They didn't build in the floodplains. They built in expectation of more earthquakes. The point is the Spanish came in and ignored that local culture. They started building in a Spanish style that wasn't appropriate to that geological environment, or tectonic environment, I suppose. And when you say we learn after the event, well, in a sense, what is the event it's after? For the Andeans, the event was over many events over thousands of years, in a sense. Oliver Smith would argue. The Spanish were acting as if there was no history, that there was no culture, there was no memory. That's where the danger lay. But you're right, when you say that, but let's just take the case of if someone does learn from the experience, there is a first time for something we learn from it. That's what I'm arguing, is that society does adapt. And actually one of the things that's quite interesting with the climate adaptation discussion the last few years is everyone's acting as if we've just invented the concept of adaptation. But the reason the buildings are built differently in Switzerland than they are in Hungary, and indeed from Scotland or Arizona, is because people have already adapted to the circumstances, although the heat today makes me think you Hungarians need to adapt to there's more air conditioning. But society is adaptive. And there's been this strange idea that adaptation has just been invented technocratically by certain institutions in the last 20 years. But you've got to ask, is it that societies were never adapted and we've just discovered this now because we're smart? Or is it that these societies are unadaptive because of centuries of colonialism? And it's a very big debate in development studies, where when you look at international development, was international development being imposed on backward cultures, or were those countries underdeveloped as a consequence of hundreds of years of rape and pillage by colonial powers? There are these two very different perspectives on what underdevelopment is. Is underdevelopment the starting point for a solution, or is it the end point of a problem? And this is the same thing, I think, with adaptation. Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I really appreciated your talk. I have some comments rather than actually a question. The point you're making is something I'm an engineer in the energy industry, so this is a very important topic, and I see the same thing you see. When I was a young engineer and I was with a group of other young engineers, our boss continually told us one thing whenever we made a presentation, and everybody made the mistake: there is correlation without causation. And it became the mantra for everybody. Don't be stupid standing up in front of people doing that. And you're pointing that out. What others are doing is, well, there's correlation, so it must be, right? The hand waving. But actually the causation could be something totally different. I perceive, maybe incorrectly, that you're actually a quite funny guy, and you have a number of good slides there. I think you are missing an opportunity to actually write an article from the other side, perhaps for The Onion or something else, about California, where I come from, where you can talk about the climate policy. California has lost population for the last 20 years. It's a migration. It's a disaster. It is a climate disaster. The forests are burning, the water's running out, taxes are high. Well, that's... Shh.
Okay, can I, sorry.
So one last thing.
Please.
When I went there in 1980, there was a water crisis. Really, a huge water crisis. We had no watering lawns, everything, just like now. And it was soon after that Utah and Arizona actually notified California that they were going to start taking their allocation of the Colorado River. So California has lost water since then, and now is in another climate crisis.
So the California case is an interesting one. And I was going to actually, I've done variations on this talk, different lengths, and I actually have a bit about California. Let's see if I can remember it. But basically, it's interesting when you look at discussions of climate change in California, because often I read an article last year that there was the wildfires in California about that, and it started saying climate change causing wildfires, and the article was all about people moving out to the suburbs, brushwood not being burnt off because of the insurance claims. You can't have small fires because a small fire could turn into a big fire, so it's not legal to do it, or insurance issues. But of course, if you don't burn off any of the brush, then you build up fuel for a massive conflagration. Plus also, a lot of the drought is because I think 90 or plus % of the water in California is going to 3% of the economy, which is agriculture, mostly almond farming, which uses a huge amount of water. And so what we're really seeing, and it's a really good example of this, and it's a whole topic I didn't really touch on in this talk, but one of the other dangers of the climate debate or the climate discussion is it often acts to depoliticize quite political phenomena. So if you look at the water policy in California, or the policies around people moving out to the encouragement of people to move out to the suburbs and have a bit of the American dream, and the lack of water, and the problems with burning off brush because of insurance and lawyers chasing you and so on, if you put all that together, there is a lot of responsibility that lies in the California government and the decisions they've made. But as long as they can always say, climate change, it absolves them not only of responsibility for part of the problem, of the conditions that led to it, but in a sense of an obligation to fix the problem that they've contributed to, which is, again, a legal or an institutional problem. It's not to say wildfires don't happen, but that's life. Nature is red and raw. We live on a planet which has its own priorities. This has always been true. The problem, you could argue, with California, it's never been a very well-adapted culture, at least for the last 50, 60 years. The massive growth and the suburbanization and the industrialization, there's a lot of these factors we're running into less to do with the climate than more to do with ourselves. And I think often one of the dangers of the climate debate is that, or the climate framing, is it can act to depoliticize the proximate causes of experiencing a problem. Yes, we know that climate change is anthropogenic in the sense it's a consequence of industrialization. In a general sense, humans are responsible. But in a specific sense of why you are vulnerable to it, that is also political. And it's at that level of the current governor in term, wherever he is, he can say it's climate change. And he can not only construe himself not as culpable, but construe himself as a hero who will save you with his climate policies.
And Tesla left because of climate migration.
Yeah.
It's not his fault.
Yeah, and so this is one of the dilemmas that, in a sense, we are all climate migrants. But this is my point with the term climate migration. If it can mean anything, what does it mean? And the context in which it has some sort of utility, rather than just a throwaway line to say I'm a climate migrant, is an institutional context where people are looking to protect people fleeing across international borders who they say are fleeing deprivation from climate change. There's a whole range of problems that come with that. If you have people fleeing Syria, for instance, who are actual political refugees, I'm not talking about, I know there's a debate about Syria in some ways, but let's assume for the sake of argument, everyone coming out of Syria is a political refugee. If you suddenly reframe it as a climatic problem, they just simply don't qualify anymore under the Refugee Convention. So there'll be real political refugees in fear of being kneecapped in the middle of the night by a regime who now would not qualify because people say, the drought that caused the conflict was a climatic drought rather than a political economic factor, for instance. And so there's a real danger of the climate debate being used and abused politically in a way that I don't think is very humane. But there's also the other absurdity with the climate migration topic that if we're saying we want to protect people fleeing deprivation from climate change, well, why are we excluding from it people fleeing any other form of deprivation? There's a colleague of mine in Oxford who came up with a term called survival migration. He said we need a survival migration framework to protect migrants fleeing deprivation over international borders, not just from climate, from any form of deprivation. To which the obvious challenge is what he's advocating for is a global welfare state, where anyone who's having a tough time can go across a border and be supported. Now, in a certain way, of course, there's an immoral appeal to that, but it's completely impractical. The problem with the climate migration debate either refers to so few people on a couple of sinking islands, so-called, in the Pacific, a couple of thousand people, or it applies to 7 billion people. And so neither of those are very useful. What we're looking for is a concept that can apply to a reasonable number of people who are in some particular state of crisis, not a handful and not billions. And it's precisely finding something of actual institutional utility where the whole thing breaks down. And my objection to come back to the first question is to that, the framing around that sort of issue. It's not about the more sort of the more universal, deeply historical sense of a correlative link between climate and society. And I would also note the point would actually be, the proper response to your point there, is not to say migration is caused by climate change, but to say society is changed by climate change. Because in some cases, some people may have migrated, sometimes cases they may not have, In some cases, the culture would have thrived. But as much as some people have migrated from climate change, some cultures have thrived. And it's, so again, it's about the specifics of the causality. It's not the general claim per se. Please, go ahead, yeah.
It's just a single point.
I can hear you. I think I hear better without the microphone, honestly.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. You did readdress me, so.
No, please, well, speak after. I don't mind. Yeah, go ahead if you want.
Well, this is just an add-on to the California situation. You know, a clear example of a climate migrant would be the migrants from Oklahoma moving to California due to a drought. And that drought lasted, what, 10 years or so? And
this is Dust Bowl.
Excuse me?
In the 30s.
Dust Bowl,
yeah.
exactly. So that was a clear example of...
Was it?
Yes, it was.
Ah, well, this is interesting because actually a lot of the stuff that went into that was a lot of it was agricultural policy, it was land management, a lot of the topsoil blown off.
But it changed the climate, and basically they had a drought.
Yeah.
Okay, whether they caused it or not, we don't know. But the point is that the crops failed and they had to move. That was a climate migrant. Clear example.
Yeah.
Okay, because they couldn't sustain themselves on the farm that was no longer a farm. So.
In a sense, though, are they not an economic migrant as well? I mean, because if the point is their livelihood has collapsed, is the point, yes. Right? So in a sense, on average, Americans move house every 10 years. And America is a very mobile society. People go for all sorts of reasons. And I think with that case, here's my point. There is more utility in framing that as a form of economic migration, and indeed looking at the political economic causes of the drought, which was largely land management, topsoil being blown off, a whole range of things like that. I can't remember all the details. But it was a product of a certain arrangement of society there that was poorly conceived. And I'm wondering, what is the added utility? We could call them climate migrants. I'm not saying you can't, but I'm saying what is gained and what is lost by doing that. I don't see what we gain in terms of a way of helping them. But I do see something lost in the sense that our understanding of the more proximate political and economic factors that went into the drought are maybe obscured.
Well, it's basically politics. That's what you're talking about. These people had to leave because they could not sustain themselves. Yeah. Whatever the reason was, it was because they had a drought. Now, that's climate.
Yeah,
okay?
completely.
Now, whether that drought was caused from human action or not, we don't know, because back then, we didn't want to... Put a world tax on climate, like they're trying to do right now.
Yeah.
A whole new tax on the entire world, okay, to pay for climate, which we don't even know what they're going to do with that money. But we do know they're going to tax everybody, okay? So that's the end goal. Yeah. The end goal is worldwide taxation, a new form of taxation, which we've never had before. Yeah. Okay? So that's my feeling on it.
So that's interesting with so I think there's an important distinction that is often not made, I don't think, or has failed to be made when we talk about climate. And in many problems in society, we know when there is a problem. Well, imagine this, by analogy, when you are sick, you know there's a problem because you're sick, but you need someone to diagnose what's making you sick in order to treat it. When we look at issues around the climate, we know there is a problem, but knowing precisely what the nature of the problem is, or indeed how to intervene on that problem, it's not a totally separate question. It's not a totally separate question, but it's not the same. It doesn't come from just knowing there is a problem. I think in society, we too often think we know there's a problem, therefore we need to find a solution. But you need to diagnose the problem as well. Simply knowing there is a problem is not the same thing as understanding it. And I think that this is, when we look at we know there is climate change, what the nature of the consequence is, and indeed what the nature of the solution would be, is totally up in the air and up for debate. And one of the frustrations around climate change in the debate, I find, is that people are often saying there is a consensus. So what? That's the starting point. It's not the end point. There's a whole range of conversations that should come in good faith after that to say, okay, we agree there is a problem, but what is the problem? What is the solution? And indeed, what is our role as a community, whatever that community may be, to go from the problem to the solution? What can we do? How? And all these questions remain untouched. And this is where I find the politicization of climate, very unhelpful, like with COVID, is that we can accept, there is COVID, for instance, in the pandemic. The question of what we do about it as a society should have been open to good faith discussion. And there was barely any discussion. If you so much as said, I'm not sure about these lockdowns, you were seen as someone who didn't care about people. That's a deeply Philistine culture. if we can't debate in good faith. I'm not even saying I have an answer on that question, but there should have been a good debate. Well, but I mean the Philistine in the sense of the Philistine in the sense that this refusal for either side to countenance not so much the other side's position, but for the refusal of everyone to find some common ground. So that's my thought on that. Please go ahead.
My question is more on the sort of social and political side of your talk rather than the natural science. I agree entirely with your very precise identification of the fallacies of policy making based on the selective cherry picking of scientific evidence. However, don't you think that in criticizing and sort of implicitly protesting against it, we find ourselves basically against the wall? It's human nature and nature of politics.
Against the what? Against the world?
Against the wall.
The wall, right.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's basically human nature and the nature of politics. Politicians and humans in general are very selective in identifying what they are going to follow and what they're going to present as an argument for in favor of a particular policy.
What is your point about the danger of inevitably, whatever you say, you're going to be caricatured into a polarized position? Is that kind of the... Yeah, and I think this is part of the danger. I'm often construed in sort of academic circles as being some climate denier. I mean, I think I was accused of being climate denier by someone at Danube Institute once. But this is the problem, is that it's such a divisive issue. It's become one of these culture war issues, you know. And I'm deeply, just temperamentally, I'm deeply not hostile, but what's the word? Dispirited and uneased by how polarized everything's got now on so many issues, you know. The failure of people to be... What's interesting, 20 years ago, the culture was to be kind of, among young people particularly, was to be cool, right? To be cool meant not to have too many opinions, to be kind of cool. But now the fashion is to be hot, right? It's to be animated about everything. It's totally flipped around. And I used to lament the fact that no one seemed to really care about anything 20 years ago. But now I think people care too much about everything. We could do with all caring a little less about some issues, but less the issues, but more this sense of identifying oneself with a particular tribe on these issues, because there should be more room for open debate. So I do find sometimes my position is construed. I submitted a paper recently, or a chapter draft, to an edited collection, and the comments I got back from the editors, I could see the hostility. It's like passive aggression in their responses, and I could see that they'd started reading it, and they felt I wasn't sharing their frame of reference. Therefore, I thought I had the opposite frame of reference in a caricatured way. And I find that very sad, that we can't assume good faith in our interlocutors. But this is the major... We always talk about epidemics these days. The biggest epidemic in the world I see right now is an epidemic of bad faith. And we see it everywhere across the culture.
Mostly from the universities.
Say again, sorry?
Coming mostly from the universities, where they won't allow you to express different points of view.
This is true, but I think it's broader than universities, but I would agree with you that there is a problem. I certainly think in the social sciences... I remember having a conversation just before I came to Hungary, and this guy didn't know I was coming to Hungary, and he said because I was an academic, he's an academic, and he's in the social sciences, he assumed I shared all of his politics. And he said, you and I are right-thinking people, by which he meant very left-thinking people. But it was interesting, this notion that he said, you and I are right-thinking people. And I love this phrase, and I say it occasionally to friends, that, well, you know, we're right-thinking people. Because it's, but the arrogance of that, to presume that that I may anoint myself a right-thinking person, is the definition of hubris. It's up to other people to decide, you know. And but I do find that in academia there is a slight self-satisfied, in some quarters of academia, there is a degree of self-satisfied performative virtue, which I think is not helpful. But it wasn't really there 20 years ago. There was much more sort of healthy cynicism. The other epidemic we have is a lack of sense of humor now. There's no, you know, that there is really, and this is left and right. Have you ever seen Jordan Peterson? That guy has no sense of humor. So it's not just on the left, it's across the spectrum. of a real epidemic of lack of sense of humor. Just to be fair here, like it's not just one side, but I think what you say about universities is right. But it's beyond universities; it's elsewhere too.
I just wanted to ask you a question about closed systems, and I'll give you a practical example. So the Himalayan aquifer, the Mekong, is being dammed by the Chinese, and because of that damming process, it's having a tremendous impact on the river environment, and as a result, there's been large-scale climate migration. So I just wonder how you'd care to respond to that, because it's a very clear example of a closed system. A large group of people who are living on a river. The circumstances change. They change because of man-made impact. How would you see those people?
Well, I think it's like saying if I shoot you with a gun, that the gun should be done for murder. Like it's me who shot you with the gun, right? And I think the same with if you're looking at that. This is precisely what I'm worried about, is that if the Chinese the Chinese government would be very thrilled if they couldn't deny people are moving, if they couldn't hide that fact and the world knew about it, they would love it for what we call climate migration. Because guess what? It's another example of China being oppressed by the global economy causing climate change. But because that's the narrative, the reason we care about climate change is we care about it because of industrialization and so on, so we're worried our anthropogenic actions are changing the climate, right? So there is this broader narrative that it's sort of something caused mostly by the West over the course of a century, which is having a general effect, meaning it's not a specific action of them building that dam, it's climate change. The danger then, if we then call them climate migrants, is it absolves the proximate actors, that's jargon, it absolves the Chinese government from any real responsibility in damming the river in a way which is completely screwed over those communities. And this is the danger of it, is that precisely the term climate migration, if used liberally, acts to depoliticize things. I don't think that is in the service of justice. It's not in the service of accuracy. It's certainly not in the service of the people being moved, because the real failure there is not the climate per se, it's the Chinese government's indifference to, in a sense, the indigenous population or the local population in that area. So it's a good example, I think, of precisely why I'm worried about the term, because it is now a term that's gained huge currency. And inevitably, if anything gains huge currency, it's open to use and abuse by actors expediently with their own agendas. And this is what I'm concerned about. The Chinese government love that sort of framing, because it precisely absolves them of responsibility. And indeed, the Assad regime loved the idea that the refugees coming out of Syria were climate refugees. And just like the California governor would love the idea that the wildfires are climatic. And again, even if there is a climate source, the vulnerability to things, as I was trying to argue with the earthquake example as an extreme example, the conditions under which we are vulnerable to natural variation, natural hazards, is cultural. And I'll end up just on that. On the crucial phrase of disaster risk reduction scholars of the last 40 years, they've been dining out on this phrase for 40 years, is earthquakes don't kill people. What kills people is collapsing buildings. The point is that natural hazards are, guess what, natural. But the degree to which they are disastrous is as much to do with us as it is to do with the hazard in question. And that's kind of my basic point here, is that in the preoccupation with the climate framing, I feel sometimes what's being lost is a focus on the thing that is not only more accurate, the social side, but is also the thing that we can do more about. And indeed, what we're really missing out is that the problem that we have today are the problems that we've always had. It's political economy, it's social organization, it's cultural. These issues have always been there. And I'd argue, just a final point on this, you know the way in the last few years, the political left has been, I see it as, it's been ideologically gentrified. The political left used to be about class interests of the working classes, which is an entirely valid framework. Whether you like the left or not, they had a real demographic they were representing. The problem is now with the sort of middle-class gentrification of the left, now they're no longer talking about class, they're talking about, gender, race, all these other issues, right? which are mostly middle-class affectations. In fact, the sort of people who would be cancelled today are actually precisely the working class, who probably don't have all the politically correct phrasings that are now popular on the left. But I think kind of the climate framing is doing this. What social justice issues have done to class issues, where class is no longer a framing issue of the left, so climate has done to political economic issues. We used to be worried about political economy, development, and so on. All of the issues around development, if you look at international development, it used to be in the year 2000, it was the Millennium Development Goals. Of the goals, Goal 8 was climate-related, environmental problems. Now, since 2015, they are the Sustainable Development Goals, where the environment is the framing concern. Although point 4 within it, I think, is also economic growth. So there's a bit of a tension in there. But it's interesting how it's extremely hard to do anything in the world now, in any policy context, to do with development or anything, without framing it through a climate framing, or increasing a lot of the other social justice issues too. I'm not sure that's, ironically, progress. I'm not sure it is, because I think it's people performing the virtue of the phrases that are currently fashionable. But the contexts we used to have were much more analytically useful, but also much more effective, because we can't necessarily do that much about the climate per se, but we can adapt to it. You know, and a lot of the problems still, in the same way, a lot of the people who are marginalized in a social justice context actually are usually lower class or marginalized class. So actually at the root of it, these things are divided by class. In the same way, the climate issues, the people vulnerable tend to be, guess what, poor people. They tend to be people of marginal communities. So why don't we get back to that sort of framing, which is free from some of the performative virtue of the climate debate, but actually allows us in a nuts and bolts grassroots way to actually do something to help people. So that's my thought on that.